In this video we're going to make this little quote book with library cards. This one has already been filled out with quotes. This one here is empty and ready to be used. So we're going to start out by taking some scrap bookboard. I wouldn't worry about the grain for this project. And I purchased these library cards on Etsy. But there are also some other links below on where you can find them. You can also get free printables online. You could also use index cards or postcards of this kind of project, but I'm using these library cards today. Measuring my library card, it's 3 inches across by 5 inches high. So I'm going to cut my 2 bookboard covers 3 1/4 inches across by 5 1/4 inches high. So just make it a tiny bit bigger than the library card. Using my square and a sharp knife, I'm just going to mark 5 1/4. Using a sharp blade, my craft knife, 3 1/4 across. You could use a pencil to mark that, but I just used the tip of the knife to make a little indent in the bookboard. Okay, so we have our front and back cover right here. If any of the edges need a sand because they're a bit rough, you can do that. These actually look fine to me. Then I'm going to find some vintage papers to cover front and back. So I'm going to look through my stash of papers. I'll take a couple dictionary pages. I like this one, Quirk. Let's take 1 dictionary page, and then a bunch of different size text is good for some texture. So some handwritten text, some pieces of this larger text would be good. This is much smaller text. See if I can find some music. Here we go. There's some music at the bottom here. What else would be good in here? Some more handwriting. This is from an old atlas. That's kind of interesting. Just using some different things. This is an old account book, which is kind of fun. There's interesting words in there. Just going to take one of these pages too. That should be enough for both the front and the back. Just maybe one more piece of music is good. There we are. So then I'm going to use some matte medium to apply the vintage papers to the bookboard. I'm using a silicone matte. This is a Ranger silicone matte, but you can find these at baking supply stores too for rolling out pastry. If you don't have a silicone mat, you could just use waste paper. You could use greaseproof paper, parchment paper, freezer paper, anything that's kind of non-stick. I'm using my 1-inch brush that I use for mediums, which is all kind of beaten up. My favourite matte medium is this Utrecht matte medium. But you could also use gel medium, you could use PVA, you could use any glue that you like to use. I just like this because it's clear, or it dries clear, and it's matte. And I keep a piece of cling film or saran wrap of this to make it easier to open the lid. So I'm going to take my vintage papers, I'm going to rip them up and collage them onto the base. I like to do strips, but if you want to do squares, With paper you can do that. If you want to cut them and have straight edges, feel free. I just happen to like a torn edge. And then I'm going to apply medium on this non-stick surface. Like this. Just lay them down straight onto the book board. So you can go over the edges a little bit, and once it has dried you can trim that up with a knife. You can smooth it out with your fingers. You could use a credit card or a bone folder. Just tear that piece off right there. So now I'm going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. Because this is non-stick, it doesn't matter that this is still wet. You can also spread the matte medium over the top as well to help push out the air bubbles. One side done. Trim all of the excess when it has dried, and then we're going to repeat with the other cover. So the front and back of the covers are done, and we're going to allow these to dry before we do the next step. Now that our covers have dried, I'm going to trim up the excess paper, get rid of it, and then go around the edges with some sandpaper to make them smooth. Oops. Might still be a tiny bit damp, that's why it's not cutting off too evenly. And right here where it's close to the edge, I'm going to take this fine grit sandpaper. You could also use an emery board and sand up the edges and make them smooth. Once they are nice and smooth, we're going to create some decoration on the cover. So with this one here, on the front and back, I used an image from a napkin. So I'm going to show you how I did that. With this one here, I used an image from some wrapping paper. Then on the inside, I just used the dictionary paper. But this was a Cavallini wrapping paper. So in order to use a napkin, napkins are 2 or 3 ply. So you open up a decorative napkin, you take a piece of tape, and you separate out the layers. So that generally pulls off that top layer, or helps to at least loosen it, so you can pull out the top layer. You can discard the other one or just leave, use it as tissue. So this gives you a nice thin layer. And we're going to lay this over the top of the text paper, and it's going to show through. So I'm just auditioning different areas. I think I like this one in the corner, right here. I'm just going to tear it. And then I quite like this pink over here. I might use the knife just to, oh no, that's not going to work. Let's just do that. If you want nice clean edges, you could use a pair of scissors for this. I just happen to like the torn edge. I'll do it like that maybe. So we're going to grab that silicone mat again. This time we're going to put the matte medium on top of the base and then lay the napkins over the top. We decide what I want to show through on the front and which I want to be on the back. I think I'm going to have this as my front cover. Just a little bit of extra paper on there. Let's just pull that off. Cut that off. There we go. I think I want this as my front. It's going to be this. So some more of the matte medium, an even layer of the matte medium over the front, and then carefully lay down the tissue. I'm going to use my brush with a little more matte medium on to push out the bubbles. I quite like leaving a few wrinkles and bubbles, but if you don't, then kind of keep working it till you get rid of them. But I quite like this texture that it leaves. You can see already that in the clear and light areas of the napkin you can see the text showing through. So that I think is going to be my front. Let's do this as my back cover. Cover the whole area with matte medium. Lay this down so you can see that the napkin is larger than the book. We're going to allow this to dry like we did last time and then trim up the excess. Just going over with another thin layer of matte medium to get rid of the wrinkles and the air bubbles. So let's set this aside for half an hour or so to let them dry. I'm going to allow these to dry for a little bit longer. And while they are just finishing up drying, I'm going to prepare my library cards. So I have about 25 here. I'm going to mark with a pencil. I'd like the hole to be right here. I don't want it to cover up the author. So I'm using a Cropadile, but you could use any kind of hole punch you have. Just going to center it on that little pencil mark that I made. I'm going to take a stack of them at a time. This Cropadile goes through quite a few, but if your hole punch only goes through one or two at a time, it'll just take you a little bit longer. So I'm using that first one as a guide to punch the holes in the subsequent ones, so they all line up. Using a little clip to keep them in place. So to get rid of those little bits of paper. Yeah, that's the last one. So you don't have to use library cards for this. Remember, there's lots of other things you could use. Just use plain paper, cardstock, index cards, like the plain or the lined, postcards, anything you like. So there we have our stack of library cards, and the holes are all roughly in the same position. Let's see if this is dry now. It feels pretty dry. I'm just going to give it another couple of minutes, and while that continues to dry, I'm going to make the words for the front. I'm going to do the same as I did on this one. I'm going to stamp quotes on a scrap of paper. So I am using these little alphabet rubber stamps. I'm also using some Versafine pigment ink. This is waterproof and a really nice dark colour. Careful though, because it can kind of get on your fingers like this. So I'm just going to make sure these ink well. Yep, that looks good. So I've just got a scrap piece of paper here. It's kind of a thick, it's like a cardstock. And I'm just spelling out quotes. Just getting off the excess ink from the stamps that I've used. Quote. So I bought this stamp set from a big box craft store years ago, but I'm sure they still sell them in places like Hobby Lobby, Michael's, Hobbycraft. You could also handwrite this. You could use a typewriter. You could use something from the printer. Whatever works. So I'm just going to set this aside to dry before I cut it out. We don't want to smear the ink. And our napkin covers should be ready now. And this, yeah, that feels good. If you want to speed up the drying, you could always use a hairdryer on there. I feel like this blade needs replacing, so I'm just going to snap off the end pieces. That's it, that's a bit sharper, it's better. Okay, just trimming up the extra. I think I'm going to have to go around this with the sandpaper one more time, just to neaten things up. Yep, the sharp knife really makes a difference. And that's why the other one was a little bit ragged. Yeah. So now these edges are all tidy. Another finishing touch that you could do is add some pen around here. So you could use a Sharpie, you could use a Posca paint pen, you could even use paint if you wanted to cover up this raw edge. I kind of like it the way it looks. You could also add some ink around the edges. You could use a distress ink to put some brown ink. Some brown ink, some black ink. I've got this vintage photo. May just use a little vintage photo around the edge just to give it another slightly more antique look. Especially if any of your papers look very white. To ink those edges. Okay, And then our quote should be dry now. Hopefully. Yep, that's dry. I could cut these letters out individually, but I'm actually just going to cut it out as one whole word. My scissors. I kind of like this grungy look. So this is looking very white and stark, so I'm going to add a little antique linen ink to this to bring down that whiteness. There we go. I may even just drag the edges through this vintage photo as well. Just get a little dimension. So I'm going to let that dry a little bit. So this is, oh gosh, what's my front? This is definitely going to be my front. So I'm going to center this. Actually, I need to flip it over probably. Don't think I'm going to see. I was going to put this here, then do a pencil mark. I might be able to see it on the front cover. I'm centering the card on here. I'm marking with a pencil. Can I see that? Not really. Use a pen. There we go. That's the cover. So I'm going to use the Cropadile again. Punch out that circle. And then here's my back cover. Remember to flip the back cover over. Lay the front cover on the top. Use the circle here as a guide so that then back and front cover will be nicely aligned. Okay, so you could, I'm using these 1-inch rings from the office supply store, but if you don't have rings you could just use a piece of ribbon to attach everything together. So here's my front cover. Slide it through the front. Let's add all of the little pages. And then add the back cover and close it up. We're almost finished. Just need to add these little quotes at the bottom. I'm going to attach it with glue stick. You could also use double stick tape. We could use matte medium. Whatever you feel is going to be most secure. This is an acid-free glue stick that I like to use. Lay that. I'm going to lay it right, line it up against the edge. Secure it with my bone folder. So finishing touch, I'm just going to find some ribbons. A couple different types of ribbon. It's quite pretty. Some small pieces. Maybe different widths. Maybe different patterns. A little bit of variety. I like the stripe on that one. It's kind of vintage looking. And I'm going to tie them around the ring and trim up. This one little knot's fine. I love this double-sided satin ribbon. Don't ask me where it's from. That feels like it needs a double knot. It's a bit slippery. And then this final gingham piece right here. Cut that tiny bit small. Only really needs one knot. So there is that finished book with the the floral napkin. Is this one, doesn't have any ribbon on yet, with the butterfly and purple flower napkin, and then this one here with the wrapping paper.